Hello everyone and welcome to The Wrap, brought to you by Michigan Medicine Headlines. I'm Dan Ellman with the Department of Communication.
And I'm Dan's best good friend, Hunter Mitchell. Today we're going to discuss the COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials that took place at Michigan Medicine and how those who ran them exemplified integrity and ethics throughout the process.
Now before we get into that, show your own integrity by going back and catching up on any episode of The Wrap you may have missed. You can find shows on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or any other podcast hosting platform. You can also catch them on the Michigan Medicine YouTube channel and as part of the Headlines Week in Review.
To get this episode going, we're joined today by Dr. Dan Call and Anna Locke. Both have helped lead COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials beginning last year. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, so Dr. Locke, let's start with you. First, can you talk about the clinical trials that were performed at Michigan Medicine regarding COVID-19 vaccines?
Well, we were involved in two clinical trials, one sponsored by AstraZeneca and the other by Janssen. We currently have a third trial that is specifically for people with history of allergy or hypersensitivity reaction.
Awesome. So before we dive into even more detail about the trials you worked on, Dr. Call, I'll direct this question to you. Can you explain to our listeners why clinical trials in general are so important in science and healthcare?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's really the only way to figure out if a new drug or diagnostic technology works or not. So without clinical trials, we really wouldn't have any idea whether a treatment is helpful or harmful. So we're critically dependent on people who are willing to participate in clinical trials.
All right, so let's get into the science behind clinical trials and how they're carried out. Now, the clinical trials carried out at Michigan Medicine were what are described as double-blind. Dr. Locke, can you explain what that means and why it's so important?
Well, double-blind means that neither the participant nor us investigative team is aware of whether the patient got the real vaccine or the placebo. This is very important because we can be very easily biased if we know what the patient actually got. Imagine that you had a headache, and if you knew what you got, you might be more likely or less likely to attribute to the vaccine or not.
Okay, so Dr. Call, when the Pfizer vaccine became available, what sort of dilemma did that create for your team?
Sure. Yeah. So this was a huge challenge for ongoing clinical trials when you have an agent that's now been shown to work for the condition that you're testing. Right. So in this case, we knew the Pfizer vaccine was safe and effective in preventing COVID. And yet we had people in our trial who had been given placebo. They didn't know if they'd gotten placebo. We didn't know if they had placebo. So we had to think about how do we make sure that everybody has access to the best possible treatment for themselves. And they're not limited from that treatment by being a part of the clinical trial, but yet make sure the clinical trial has the best chance to generate an answer to the question of whether that particular vaccine worked.
Yeah. Can you explain that actually a little bit further and just in depth about when you say placebo? So that just means somebody's not actually getting the vaccine itself, right? And that's sort of the way to test on the efficacy of a vaccine?
Yeah, exactly. So when people would come in to participate in the clinical trial, we would then send a code sort of to the pharmacy, which we wouldn't see. It comes from a third party, right? And that would tell the pharmacy whether or not to make a syringe with basically salt water in it or to make a syringe with vaccine in it. And then we would go get that syringe essentially from the pharmacy, from the investigational pharmacy, and we wouldn't be able to tell which it was, nor would the patient know. So that's the placebo, the salt water.
Okay. So you once the Pfizer vaccine becomes available, you need to figure out a way whether to tell these patients, hey, you can go get the Pfizer vaccine because you haven't already gotten a vaccine or not. So you carried out what was an unblinding process. Dr. Locke, how did your team go about doing that, and how did your participants react to the unblinding process?
Well, we had this huge dilemma. In clinical trials, we like to preserve the integrity of the data as much as we can. And once we unblind and we know that the placebo group now get the Pfizer vaccine, we will completely mess up with the data, making the data much more difficult to interpret. And normally we would never unblind unless there's a serious safety concern, in which case we need to know what exactly the participant got. But in this case, we had this moral dilemma. There's just some COVID, which might kill participants, and we have something to protect them. And yet we didn't know whether we had actually given them the protection. So as clinical investigators, we have to balance preserving the integrity of the trial and also the best interest of the participant. In this case, the best interest of the participant is to be able to let them know, did you get the real vaccine? If not, you have the opportunity to get the real one. So what we did was we delay the unblinding as much as we can. Essentially, we asked the participant, be patient, wait until you have an appointment. You know for sure when you actually get to receive the Pfizer vaccine before we do the unblinding. And as you know, I mean, people initially had to wait for the appointment, but later on we're able to get the appointments pretty quickly. So once they let us know that they have an appointment, we sometimes have less than 12 hours to process the unblinding, which is quite a challenge.
Wow. So this question's for both of you, but we'll start with you, Dr. Call. In the end, you stuck with your ethics and the core value of integrity. What advice would you say to others who may face similar situations in the future?
Well, I think you just have to look from the perspective of the clinical trial participant and from the ethics that we know and are all trained in around clinical trials, and make sure that you're comfortable doing the right thing. And I would say if you're waking up at night and not feeling good about the way things are going, there's probably a problem. And if you're sleeping soundly, you're probably doing the right thing. And the other thing in situations like this is we're fortunate to have people in medical ethics, people in our IRB that we can go to for help and make sure that our plan makes sense both for the clinical trial enterprise, but most importantly for the participants.
Yeah, and I would say that as a researcher, preserving the integrity of the science is the most important. But we also doctors at the same time. And as some doctors, is always the safety and the best interest of our patients, and in this case, our participants, that override everything.
Yeah. Thank you so much to both of you for the advice and insight that you've shown into this. I know it was a huge moral dilemma that you faced, but I think you carried it out in really as quality of a way as you possibly could, where you're preserving the data, but also helping the participants who were helping you, right, with taking part in these clinical trials. Now, if you want to learn more about the COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials at Michigan Medicine, you can find a story at mmheadlines.org. That's mmheadlines.org.
Well, we want to learn more about one of you today, and Dr. Kaw, you lost in rock, paper, scissors. So you'll be taking part in the lightning round today. We're going to ask you about 4 questions in just 1 minute. Are you ready to go?
Sure.
All right, here's the first question. What is the most challenging part of the pandemic to you personally?
Yeah, I just think that the way we had to kind of reinvent so many things that we do in the hospital, the way that we had resource and staff limitations that we've really never faced before, particularly early in the pandemic, was probably the most challenging part, and just the level of uncertainty and what was going to happen next.
So on the flip side of that, what is one of the most positive things you can take away from the past 15 months?
Well, that's an easy one. I mean, I got to work with all sorts of people, like Dr. Locke, who I've known for many years, but I'd never worked as closely with her, and to see the amazing ways people like Dr. Locke, Dr. Lagogo, who really led this trial, and many others really, stepped up and helped both take care of our patients and answer these fundamental questions like, will a vaccine work, to help get us out of this pandemic.
Yeah, your team had a personal stake in it. I think that's great. Now, Memorial Day is just around the corner. What's your favorite holiday to celebrate with family or friends?
My favorite holiday, probably 4th of July. The weather's nice. We often go to a beach house, and so most relaxing for me.
Nice. All right, last question. This week, Superhero Day was held at Mott. If you could have one superpower, what would it be?
Well, that's got to be flying.
Good choice.
Of course it does. All right, you did it. Thank you so much, Dr. Call and Dr. Locke, for joining us today. Once again, if you want to learn more about COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials, go to mmheadlines.org. That's mmheadlines.org.
And while you're there, check out some other featured stories from this week. For instance, you could learn in which colleagues recently earned a Making a Difference award and take a look at some of the pets faculty and staff adopted during the pandemic. Find all that and more at mmheadlines.org.
All right, Hunter, so you just mentioned pets during the pandemic. Do you have any pets or did you have any while growing up?
I had a family dog growing up that's still around. She's a little bit older and stuff, but I love her. She's got a lot of quirks, and one of my favorite ones is she can't walk on hardwood floors unless she's going backwards. Then she's completely fine. So when we see her doing that, we'll all make little backup noises for her so people know she's
That's
back.
awesome. You got the beeps going for her?
Beep, beep. Yeah, it's adorable.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah. Yeah, so my wife and I have a little Bichon, a little 22-pound Bichon, and something mix. We don't know. He was a rescue. We rescued him about 8 years ago. Full of anxiety. Doesn't necessarily like other people or other dogs, but he loves us. So he just wants to cuddle and, lay on the couch with us. So he's kind of a joy to have around. Growing up, I never had a pet in my family except for, well, it's kind of a sad story. There was about a week that we were pet sitting for one of our family friends. They had a bird, and we were pet sitting that bird, Tweeters. And well, my cousin was visiting, and she had Tweeters on her shoulder and went out into the garage to get a drink, and the garage door was open, and that was the end of Tweeters as Tweeters flew away. So, Dr. Quall, if he could fly, would have used his superhero to fly after Tweeters and rescue her. But
Absolutely.
that was so sorry to bring a sad note to it, but yeah, that's my pet story.
Tweeters is still out there, though.
Yes,
living
Tweeters
in
is still out there.
All right. Well, it's time for the weekly trivia contest. And last episode, we asked listeners, which type of awards did nurses who were featured during Nurses Week recently win? The answer is Daisy Awards. Congratulations to Bailey Merzick, who sent in the correct answer. Bailey, a member of the Department of Communication, will be in touch shortly to help you claim your prize. For this week's question, here's Dan.
All right. Well, this week's question should be pretty easy if you paid attention to today's episode. This week's question is, which COVID-19 vaccines were used in clinical trials at Michigan Medicine? Once again, which COVID-19 vaccines were used in clinical trials at Michigan Medicine? You can find the answer by rewinding this episode or checking out last week's headline story. And once you know it, send it to headlines@med.umich.edu for the chance to win a prize.
That's all the time we have for this week. Dr. Locke and Dr. Call, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, thank you to all our listeners and viewers for everything you do for families, patients, and each other.
We'll see you next week.